Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's Grand Bargain Cash Workstream subgroup webinar, which is focusing today on donor perspectives and looking at the potential for forging stronger links between humanitarian cash and social protection in light of COVID-19 and how this can be financed. My name is Lois Austin. I work with the Grand Bargain Cash subgroup on linking humanitarian cash and social protection. And we're going to start today's webinar with our usual poll to try and give us an idea of who's participating. And this will help our speakers to know how to tailor their comments and their interventions. So please do specify now, select if you're a social protection actor, a humanitarian actor, a combination of both of those, or neither of these. We'll let this run for a few seconds more, and I'll count down from 3 to closing the poll. So 3, 2, 1. And we'll see if we can see the results. So today in the audience, we have the majority of participants are both working in social protection and in the humanitarian environment, 34%. 32% are solely humanitarian actors, 24% solely social protection, and 11% of the audience don't fit neatly into either of these categories. So just to give a little bit of background before we get into the substance of today's discussion. This subgroup is co-led by UNICEF, by the IFRC, and by FCDO, and it's part of the work of the subgroup to reinforce dialogue and knowledge sharing between humanitarian and development stakeholders to support the linking of humanitarian cash and social protection in times of crisis. This knowledge sharing work is led by UNICEF and funded by FCDO, formerly DFID. In addition to monthly webinars like this one, the subgroup is also boosting knowledge and learning, for example, through a weekly newsletter, and you can find the link to that in the chat box. We've also been running a live mapping which shows countries where there are links between humanitarian cash transfers and social protection responses to COVID-19. Again, the link to that is in the chat box. And if you do take a look at that and see that there's any information that would be useful to add from a country perspective, then please do go ahead and do that. And we're in the process of developing a series of case studies to highlight experience from COVID-19 interventions where links have been made. This subgroup is linked to socialprotection.org's webinars and events, and they've got 2 upcoming webinars which might be of interest to you, and you can find them on their website. So the first one, which will be on Tuesday next week, Tuesday the 24th of November, will be the virtual launch of the World Social Protection Data Dashboards. And the next one after that, on Thursday next week, is the trajectories between study and work, old and new challenges for young people. I'll leave it to Nupur to introduce our 4 panelists and to facilitate today's conversation. Thank you, Nupur.
Many thanks, Lois. And it's my pleasure to moderate this webinar today. Friends, we all know that the ecosystem of linking humanitarian cash with social protection has multiple stakeholders in it. And till now, who play a very, very important role in ensuring that some of the ideas that we have on linkages are actually implemented through funding. But of course, that's not the only role that donors plays. They also play other roles. And so today's webinar is going to be more like a conversation. I will be speaking with, they started working with the EU 20 years ago, and she has over 20 years experience in development policy and international cooperation. Currently, her work covers social protection in DEFCO headquarters. She has worked in Bangladesh previously for the EU delegation. Then on the panel, we also have Heidi. She is the humanitarian advisor with FCDO, formerly DFID. She is a part of the social protection team in UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, which, as I said earlier, used to be known as DFID. She currently oversees the space service through the role in providing Basic Social Assistance in Crisis, which is in short form called BASIC. She has worked in Iraq and also in Ethiopia before working at the HQ with FCDO. Then on the panel, we have William. William comes with more than 12 years of experience in very, very difficult and challenging humanitarian context. He is the Economic Recovery and Market Systems Advisor with USAID, BHA, and he will be talking from the experience and will be representing USAID in this webinar. And then we have Eileen. Eileen is the Social Protection Policy Lead in the Development Cooperation and Africa Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for Irish Aid. She has previously worked in Ethiopia and Tanzania as Deputy Head of Development with the Ireland Embassy, overseeing humanitarian development and livelihood portfolios. So that's the panel today. And as I said earlier, the format will be more conversational. So I will ask a few questions and to kickstart the discussion, and really look forward to all the questions coming in from the audiences so that we can ask those questions on your behalf, and we'll have our panelists answer those. So please use the question and answer box next to the chat box on your screens, at the bottom of your screens, to pose your questions. So to kickstart, let me first invite Dorothy to talk about a bit about your agency's position and experience on linking humanitarian cash and social protection. And also, if you could give us an idea on the volume of funds or the overall volume of funding that has gone to cash transfers. And if you can give us an idea of if there's been any funding that has gone to specifically support the linkages. This is a question I will be asking all the panelists to start the discussion. So I'm inviting Dorothy first.
Okay, thank you very much, Nurpur. So I will try to keep it short here. I mean, what might be interesting for, I understand that we have a lot of humanitarian aid audience in here and people dealing with social protection as well. I'm from a development organization, so DEVCO of the European Commission, as Nurpur pointed out already. So we have more of a long-term perspective, of course, working closely with our partners in the European Commission, which is ECHO, which is our DG on the European Civil Protection Humanitarian Aid, and with NIA, which is our DG on the neighborhood and enlargement. So basically we have 3 agencies dealing with a humanitarian aid plus with development cooperation. So perhaps I provide a bit the political perspectives. That's what I wanted to say here. So I don't want to go back to until we, since we started to work closely because in general terms, humanitarian aid and development cooperation, just to be named the European Consensus for Development, where you have references on how we should work together. We do have the so-called EU Nexus approach. There was a joint donor statement and humanitarian aid transfer as well. So there are different things in policy terms. I think there are some links provided as well, so I will not cite in detail from all those communications we do have. So this is the political coverage, so to say. In very practical terms, bringing together humanitarian aid, cash transfers plus development cooperation, it might be interesting for you. I just named the 3 institutions working together. We have in DEVCO a special unit dealing with resilience, of course. We do have a common package. This is, I think, very hands-on as well, a so-called SPAN package, where we bring together how, in practical terms, we work between this of 2019, humanitarian aid and development cooperation with a more medium long-term perspective. Just this as a background, general terms, then more specifically on social protection. So for you to know, we do have roughly 30 programs, so-called geographic programs on social protection with our partner countries throughout the world. And of course, in there we do have components which include cash transfer, humanitarian aid. Perhaps just to name as an example, we have a big program, I think of over 100 million euros there in Lebanon, where we run a EU trust fund, where we have the different strands in there. For example, we have two target groups. One is on refugees from Syria living in Lebanon. The other ones are the vulnerable people in Lebanon. So both need to be addressed, of course. The refugees are getting cash transfers. The vulnerable people, the Lebanese people are not getting cash transfers. In parallel, we try to support the government of Lebanon to build a medium long-term social protection system. So this is a very good example, in other words, to say, voila, we have something here which is really like we go hand in hand, humanitarian aid, cash transfer on one side, and development cooperation feeding into a more medium long-term perspective, supporting the government on the other side. Just to come back on your second question there, and I keep it short because you wanted to have numbers. So I don't want to give you all the numbers in talking because it's all on the link provided as well. Overall, this is important. So right after the crisis politically, European Commission has been very active together with the EU member states, which is called Team Europe approach. Today, we have leveraged 39 billion euros as a COVID response overall. Of course, this COVID response goes well beyond social protection. It addresses first emergency response, secondly support to health, water and sanitation systems, and third measures to mitigate the economic, political and social impact of the crisis. In here, obviously, you do have social protection. You have a lot of information on our websites, be it DEFCO, be it ECHO, NEAR, and the EIS, the European External Action Service as well. So my last point here, social protection, what does it mean in terms of COVID response? So what we have done as well together with ECHO, together with NEAR, together with the EIS, we boosted the existing programs, the geographic programs. I was just mentioning we have roughly 30 programs being implemented in partner countries. So we did a lot of front loading of payments, which still have to be done. So we really acted quickly. We tried to lower a little bit the conditionalities. So paying cash transfers without conditionalities as quickly as possible. We did top ups. You need to know that we are at the end of the programming phase. The EU budget is from until 2020. From next year, there will be a new programming phase, 21-2027. This is the overall EU budget. And of course, we are in line with this programming cycles. So then, yeah, we did additional top ups. We added cash transfer as well. And what is interesting as well, we have transferred some of our funds we could not provide as quickly as we would have liked to ECHO, to humanitarian aid. So we transferred funds for Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Mali, Pakistan, because we know that our colleagues from ECHO can respond quicker to this kind of crisis. Perhaps I'm about to finalize my intervention here. For us, it's important to see now as well what will happen. So there's a short-term response. There have been a lot of council conclusions. There's a joint communication. You all find it in the link collection. I think it's really useful to read if you want to understand our thinking better and the way we work. This is a bit like what will we do in the medium and long term when it comes to social protection response? But I guess we might have this as a question later on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Jyoti. That was quite comprehensive, and thank you for keeping to the time as well. Let me move on to Heidi. Heidi, the same question for you. If you can tell us about your agency's position and experience on linking humanitarian cash with social protection, and also if you can give us an idea of the volume of funds, and specifically on volume of funds for cash transfers and on linking humanitarian cash with social protection. So over to you, Heidi.
Great, thanks, Nupur. So it should come as a surprise, not a surprise to many, that FCDO has been dedicated to supporting the use of social protection approaches in crises for quite some time now. This includes even in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, the role, ensuring that there was the statement on the role of social protection in crises, and our well-known shock responsive social protection work. And our emphasis on this does flow through our policies, our programs, and our international engagement. And so with the 2017 UK government's humanitarian reform policy, there is reference to supporting social protection and a focus on preparedness and resilience, building shock responsive social protection systems, and bringing together humanitarian and development funding to address protracted crisis situations as well. So that's firmly there in our humanitarian policy. We also have within the Chase cash policy team, there is the UK's approach to cash and vouchers, which of the 12 principles, one of them is looking at the possibilities and options for linking with social protection. And from an engagement perspective, as mentioned at the outset of this webinar, we do co-chair the Grand Bargain subgroup on linking humanitarian cash and social protection, and bring funding to the group through positions like Lois's and other strategic consultancies. So certainly something that from our position is strong. We also have a long-standing experience working in this, and I mentioned the shock responsive social protection work that was led by OPM, but even before that, we funded ODI to look at social protection in the response to the 2008-9 financial, food, and fuel crisis. So really over 10 years of experience. Most recently, and what you may be aware of, we have a current business case operating right now, which is really specifically focused on providing technical support, capacity building, influencing, and generating research and evidence on linkages and the effective social assistance in context of recurring shocks, protracted conflict, and forced displacement. And that is the basic program, the Better Assistance in Crisis program, running until March 2024, and with a £20 million value. So we are looking across the whole continuum of response and working in humanitarian crises and those with and without social protection systems in place, and how we can use social protection approaches, which does include the linkages at various stages. And so we have that business case and that program, which is really providing the technical support and the research. But across various country offices where FCDO is, we have been working on this topic for years and years, from the more the earlier programs in Kenya and Ethiopia, the Hunger Safety Net program, the Productive Safety Net program, which did look at humanitarian response and addressing some of these systemic food security issues. But also even in Yemen, we are also looking at this with UNICEF and other actors, where the systems are more nascent and the relationships with government are more complicated and complex. And we are seeing in a lot of cases that linkages are being integrated into new business cases and new programs, and roles which were potentially separated previously and in two different programs are now coming together under a cash and social assistance program that will address humanitarian and longer term social protection needs. So that's a really positive development that we are seeing across the globe. And of course, linkages have been a focus for our COVID response, and many of you are familiar with our space initiatives, social protection approaches in COVID-19, expert advice, and that's in partnership with GIZ. And we always ensure that there is a social protection and a humanitarian angle on all of our calls and all of our support. We bring in experts from both sides, as well as from a gender and social inclusion angle, and so that we can really draw out linkages and opportunities where this could be built on, regardless of whether our user has asked for social protection support or humanitarian cash support. We always give them both. So that's been quite successful. On the latter question around the volume of funds, this is a slightly complicated question for us in the midst of our response, and our funding data is quite fluid. So in addition to giving unearmarked funds and core funding to some agencies, which do in turn use it for cash responses. And so approximately 25% of our humanitarian assistance is cash. And we are seeing a huge increase in interest in the linkages work as well in the COVID response. Our space service has been widely used by FCDO country offices, I think over 56 times in the last few months. So trying to seek out where they can get advice on how to take this work forward. And similarly, it's been difficult to keep pace with the new programs that governments and government partners have been launching, but we do work in more than 25 countries on social protection and also more than 25 countries on humanitarian cash responses. Some of those are overlapping and some are not the same. And that social protection assistance is more and more giving technical assistance to governments in addition or as well as cash transfers directly. So sorry to not be able to answer that directly in terms of pounds, but we are seeing this is definitely an area of increased interest and funding. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. I have a small, tiny question related to that. This 25% of humanitarian cash, of the overall humanitarian portfolio being for cash, does that include space or spaces outside of this 25%?
That would be outside. The space program is, as a technical assistance, is relatively small, and also basic wouldn't include that. So that's in our humanitarian division, and real humanitarian cash transfers that are being supported globally in our country offices is what we're really referring to there on the humanitarian cash angle. And we are doing commissioning an update on those figures. So we're hoping to see an increase, but it does take some time to collect all of those figures, and it'll be a bit delayed until we can actually give those refreshed numbers.
Thank you. Thanks, Heidi. Let me move to William now, William from USAID, with the question that I had earlier asked about telling us a bit about your agency's position and experience on linking humanitarian cash with social protection, and also if you can give us an idea on the overall volume of funds, particularly for cash transfers, and if there are if you can give us an idea also about the funds that have flown towards making these links. Over to you, William.
Thank you very much, Nupur, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. So as you know, USAID mandate cover from preparedness to emergency response, recovery and development. And today I'm speaking more from the humanitarian assistance side of things. So if you look at the humanitarian assistance side of things from the US government, you have what former Food for Peace and OFDA now merge into what we call the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, which I'm representing today in this panel. And within the US government, we also have the humanitarian assistance coming from the Department of State Bureau for Population, Refugee and Migration. So I'm just, please consider that today I'm giving more an overview of what we are doing on the humanitarian side of things. And if you look at that, linking humanitarian cash with social protection is not new for USAID. We supported different forms of social protection and safety net since at least the late 1980s. And this support evolved over the time in terms of the kind of safety net we support, the support, where we support, and for what goals. But in terms of experience, just to give you, to name a few, support to social protection systems, we've done that in Armenia, in Haiti, Rwanda, Tanzania, Tunisia, Yemen, Ecuador, just to name a few, and always through multiple humanitarian aid and recovery and resilience initiatives. The most recent USAID linkages can be found in various initiatives, and I would say our most emblematic support in response to COVID is probably the support the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance provided to Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net Program, also known as PSNP. That's the social protection program in Ethiopia, since we support it since its inception back in 2005. And recently with COVID, we work on the linkage and in addition of providing additional funding with humanitarian assistance in response to COVID-19 this year. We also have work on these linkages through Feed the Future from former Food for Peace, and also lastly from the Bureau for Population, Refugee and Migration. We supported the piloting of the graduation approach through UNHCR and NGO partners in several contexts, and I can tell you more about it later. It's very interesting. Now, in terms of our position, I would go over like 3 positions. First, with our experience, we recognize that safety nets have been shown to help households to mitigate the impacts of shock and stresses, but also we notice that helps generating community assets through public work projects that provide the much needed improvement in infrastructure, the land management, livestock support, while the cash transfer provide a boost to the local economy by stimulating the demand for local goods and services. The second position is about, USAID is aiming to reduce the need for foreign assistance on the long term, and that is guided by our agency's journey to self-reliance. So at the highest level, this journey demonstrates a country ability to plan, finance, and implement solutions to its own development. And on the humanitarian side of things, we do that in a variety of ways. At the most basic level, it does, we do so by providing life-saving assistance. That's what we do best. And lastly, our position was expressed recently, the US government position. We are signatory of the Grand Bargain subgroup on linking humanitarian cash and social protection in response to COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, we did this paper together. There are a couple of positions expressed in this paper, namely scale up the use of cash where appropriate, deliver humanitarian cash by using, linking, or aligning with local and national social protection systems, where possible and appropriate, rapidly undertake coordinated preparedness and planning, and finally partner with local and national organizations and reinforce capacities as needed. So all these principles we are, as US government, we are committed to. Now, regarding the funding, as the other donors, we don't have necessarily a dedicated strategy office or coding system to actually track these safety net programming. So the programs are labeled as safety nets. So, and that covers a wide spectrum of different efforts with different goals and approaches to implementation. So it's very hard to track, all this into a single indicator. However, we can, we do follow this collection of programmings that contribute to safety nets and social protection. So we have a comprehensive inventory of our programming in this area. But just to give you an idea, I'd like to be close to give you some numbers, even if that doesn't directly, address your question about the numbers of linkages. In terms of volume, if you look at the cash USAID Food for Peace program in fiscal year 19, it represented 1.2 billion in cash and voucher assistance. About $500 million was cash transfer. And on the OFDA side, former OFDA side, it was 61 million in 2019 for multipurpose cash and 21 million in cash transfer. And these figures are just a transfer only. They are not including, the overheads and program costs. So that's transfer made to beneficiaries directly. I don't have in these numbers the numbers from PRM. So, we need to add that. And we are working on numbers for 2020. If you look at the COVID side of things, and I'm almost done, if you look at the COVID side and only for the humanitarian assistance, the additional humanitarian assistance we provided for COVID, this represents $558 million in humanitarian assistance, which for some of it was like cash and voucher assistance to assist with the COVID-19 response, and some of it to link with social protection programs. And I have 2 examples to give you an idea of the scale of the programming when we're doing these linkages. So I mentioned Ethiopia earlier, where we supported 1.3 million PSP and PSNP clients prior the crisis. And some of it was then pivoted, some of this existing support to help with COVID-19. With the same beneficiaries, and also to work on the expansion or the horizontal expansion and vertical expansion. And on top of that, we funded an additional 27 million in new humanitarian assistance, of which 5 million was humanitarian cash assistance due to the limitation on the social protection platform to address the needs and to absorb the support. In Ecuador, finally, we did a $5 million intervention in response to COVID-19 in partnership with WFP. And we reached a total of 17,000 households through two modalities. One with the government social protection program. So one was cash transfer for a 2-month period worth $240 to 1,400 beneficiaries, families. And the other modality was distribution of food voucher for the same amount through INGOs for about a little bit less than 16,000 families. That's it from me. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. Just so that you know, your camera froze, but it was good that, and you were very loud and clear in your, so your mic was working, which is great. And thank you so much for the comprehensive information that you've provided. I do have a lot of questions on some of these, but I will move to Eileen to give us first her agency's IDShade's position and experience on linking humanitarian cash with social protection. And also, Eileen, the same question to you, if you could give us an idea of the volume of funds, especially for cash transfers, and if you can also give us an idea of how much of that goes towards linking humanitarian cash with social protection. And if you can also, link it with COVID, that will be great. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Nupur. I guess from Ireland's perspective, really, reducing humanitarian need is really one of the key priorities under our policy for international development. And within that, we recognize that we really need to work a lot more coherently across the humanitarian development and peace nexus, and linkages across social protection and social protection and cash are essential in order to sort of bridge that divide between humanitarian and development. I guess I just want to also reference our social protection strategy, which again commits to that approach, and also our humanitarian assistance policy. And just to draw out, I really think it's really critical to go to the root of the sort of issues in order to sort of progress this agenda, which I think has made a lot of progress, but I think in the current context, there's massive potential to move forward, which will be really critical, because not only COVID, and COVID has really highlighted that the sort of relevance of cash, where we've seen our own country sort of scale up cash responses to sort of mitigate against the socioeconomic impact of COVID, and globally where those systems exist, you've seen that scale up taking place, but also recognizing that we're seeing increasing climate risk related challenges and also conflict related challenges. So I think working across this continuum of response and linking cash and sort of social protection is really essential. But I think that there's sort of 4 sort of key areas that were identified in our policy, in our humanitarian assistance policy, which sort of bridges, which we all need to bridge in order to move this agenda forward. And one's really around the timeframes, the funding in terms of inflexibility or approaches to finances. I think around analytical tools often and conceptual tools, we often see separate, we're making progress. And also in terms of some of the challenges around institutional barriers. So really, I think in terms of our response, it really has been we work in partners. We work with bilateral civil society and a broad range of partners, both at the global, but also at the country level, and as well as being a member state. We're part of the EU Team Europe approach. And really what we're sort of our priority has been really around encouraging our partners to allocate funding based on joint humanitarian and development context analysis. So getting your understanding and your political economy of that contextual framework really right to begin with. And then from that, we've really prioritized in our social protection strategy, a whole systems approach to linkages between humanitarian cash transfer and social protection based very much on the context, because the context is really critical. And perhaps what you can do in Ethiopia is quite different with the approach you take in Yemen or in other contexts. So that whole, and I think that whole information management system really sort of looking at the systems approach. And the other option, the other approach that we've also taken has really also been around accountability and trying to align that mechanisms for learning. We've undertaken, as part of our response to COVID, we've worked with the Institute for Development Studies and conducted some analysis across a number of countries, including Ethiopia, Malawi, and Uganda, around shock responsive social protection and some of the learning that's coming across those linkages. And I think making the connection between the sort of systems, the capacity development, the accountability mechanisms, and sort of feeding that learning, but making sure that you have your political economy at the heart of that process. So you're able to invest in the technical element, but bringing back the sort of policy dialogue at sort of influences in terms of bringing that change up. In terms of, we have also, in terms of our approach to financing for humanitarian cash and social protection, again, our approach has really been, at the center of it has been the need and the context in terms of what is that particular need and how do we best respond to that need. And really, I think flexibility has been the approach, in that we have provided unearmarked funding to address that. While we've encouraged cash and social and linkages to social protection, and our approach has been really over 50% of our humanitarian financing is unearmarked, and around 41% is softly earmarked. And then in addition to that, around 53% of our humanitarian spend is multi-annual financing. So that really allows to sort of partners to start building the beginning of the systems, and then linking it to sort of investment in resilience. So it's really looking at the whole continuum of response, while we invest in sort of early warning systems, in sort of the immediate response, and then in recovery and resilience. And in a sense, working very collaboratively with EU colleagues, but also partners more broadly, and feeding that learning. I will leave it at that for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eileen. That was helpful, and I'm going to come back to you with another follow-up question later. But let me invite William. I hope, William, your camera is working now. And I had a follow-up question. If you can give us an idea of what guides the decision-making to allocate funding to efforts to linking humanitarian cash and social protection within USAID?
Yes. So, like on the humanitarian assistance funding side of things, we have priorities, and the resources are limited to save lives. And the bulk of our resources come from our, what we call IDA, the International Disaster Assistance funding. and what you might know as Title II, also known as DIPSA for practitioner in the webinar. So that's a two big bulk of money that comes to fund our assistance. So we do link when it's appropriate, which means when the objectives of saving lives align, saving life on the humanitarian side, aligns with the poverty alleviation on the development side. We also, the US government strengthened the relief and development coherence for the Nexus, and we made it a key policy priority. So that translates into new bureaus, what we call the R3 bureaus, which are that's under the USA transformation, and now these R3 bureaus are under one associate administrators, and they are the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, so the bureau I'm working for, the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, CPS, and the Resilience and Food Security, RFS. So that means, now it translates into a continuity of technical assistance, but also potentially funding, right? And we also took the opportunity finally with the merger of former Food for Peace and OFDA, now Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, to rewrite our application guidelines. And there is a section where we indicate, how you can get funds from this emergency funding to make this linkage. So I just took an extract, and we say basically it is a best practice to coordinate multi-purpose cash assistance or food assistance with social protection interventions as appropriate. So that means when applicants are applying for funding, for emergency funding, there are options also to get this funding from this emergency funding, either IDA or Title II, to fund linkages when it is appropriate. Okay.
Thanks, William. That was very useful to know. Maybe I'll move to Heidi, because I do want to know, Heidi, what are the challenges that you see from a donor perspective to support work on linkages? Are there any challenges at all? And if there are, what those could be from a donor perspective?
Sure, thanks, Nupur. I think we can all acknowledge that this work is not easy, and I think that's from all angles, donors as well as implementers. It's disruptive, it's uncomfortable, it's not our normal way of working, actually, in social protection or humanitarian sectors. But it is potentially transformative, and it's important to overcome those challenges and barriers. From an external side, I think there are a lot of different stakeholders involved, and they're all critical in taking this work forward. And as Zara mentioned in one of her questions, there are not always the coordination structures in place to bring the conversations and the decision makers together. So just that even starting point can be a problem. There's a complexity of relationships, and those are donor-implementer relationships, but also the positioning that agencies have vis-a-vis each other, the incentive structures to engage in these conversations. It can be difficult to navigate, and it's not limited to international organizations and donors, but is also often playing out with social development and emergency response ministries within host governments as well. So there is a huge political economy challenge to overcome, and just in terms of bringing people together on this agenda point. So there's also not one clear starting point or way forward, and it can take time to find a clear path or an entry point to initiate some of this work. And partners often need the human resources to be funded to even begin exploring these linkages fully. And it's hard to make room in people's already busy roles. And so we as donors can, that applies to us, but also externally, we can ask questions and have you spoken to government? Have you explored other opportunities? And we know that that's in addition to their day job, let's say. And so, for example, when I was a humanitarian advisor in Iraq, I actually just decided to fund 3 people in 3 different organizations to coordinate. But I had to take such a radical step in order to make sure that they had that time carved out to think and take this work forward. So, and even from a practical standpoint, because there is not always a clear way forward or entry point, sometimes at a proposal stage, it can be difficult to define what the deliverables will be after a year of coordination, engagement, where we can really expect to get to also with host governments in that duration. So there really needs to be an investment in process. In terms of internal challenges, this work also cuts across our internal sectors. At FCDO, we have more flexibility in the movement of our funds, so that isn't a restriction for us. But we do have social development advisors with social protection experience, and we have humanitarian advisors. And there's a few who work across the two, but that is a skill set which we are still working on and developing. And in some countries, we will have one team and not the other. And that's something we saw in COVID, where this is really relevant for everyone. Sometimes there wasn't any social protection experience, and sometimes there was no humanitarian or emergency response experience in our development contexts. And, we also are at times reliant on interlocutors such as the World Bank to broker our relationships with governments. And we may not have an intimate knowledge of the host government systems and what those entry points are. And of course, those relationships are longstanding, and we might need to focus on other key priorities, especially if we feel the government is stretched in their delivery already. And so as much as this is a priority and we are always pushing it at FCDO, we have a broader, longer term perspective, which we have to keep in mind as well. So just a few challenges, but we still encourage everyone to try and prioritize this area. Over.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks also for picking up some of the questions that have been posted. So that saves a bit of time. Thank you so much.
I don't know if I answered Zara's question.
I'm going to come back to those questions.
I did acknowledge it's a real one. Overcome.
I'm going to come back. In fact, I'm going to Dorothy now. Maybe I'll wrap up one of those questions into the question that I was going to ask her. Dorothy, what in your opinion is the future of linking humanitarian cash with social protection? Given some of the questions that have been posted in the chat box about the coordination part itself, we don't see as much coordination happening. There should be much more, and it is possible to do much more. So what do you think from a donor perspective is the future of linking? And are there any opportunities that we could, that you would like to share with us as practitioners who straddle both sides of the world, especially now in the context of COVID? What might be the opportunities of that? So
Look,
over to you,
I got some sorry, I think I got the most challenging question here. Thank you for that. No, look, sorry for interrupting. So what I think, like in the first place, we need to, like what we can do right now, what we have learned, I think through COVID as well, referring to this, is that we really need to do ex-ante resilient social protection systems. This is where the humanitarian actors and the ones in development cooperation really need to work together to support partner countries according to their national sector policies in designing programs which, when crisis occurs, can be get a bit bigger and be taken back a little bit if the crisis is over. So this is like the immediate. But I think, like overall, I mean, I've been working here on social protection for a good year, and before I've been working social protection in Bangladesh as well and human sectors as well. What I find is that social protection is still quite new in development cooperation. I find as well it goes well beyond the development cooperation, humanitarian aid. This is a discussion we might want to have at a higher level beyond the development community. What became clear is throughout COVID is that we cannot afford not to have systems to address the needs of people in crisis and beyond. And the positive news here is as well that a lot of partner countries already have like more or less systems. They do not have only social safety nets as they had like 20 years ago. So they're really making an effort in order to build it up, and we as donors should support them, I think. But it requires quite a tough conversation, because this is about domestic revenue mobilization. And this is something like where it's really expensive to build up social protection systems, you know. So it's a discussion we need to have, like perhaps beyond the bilateral relations we have with partner countries at a higher level, and beyond domestic resource mobilization and ODA as well. But I think what is a positive outcome of COVID is that we really, I mean, after health, I would say social protection was the most requested, huh? I know quite a lot of colleagues who might never had heard of social protection. It's always the animal you need to explain. Health is quite straightforward. Social protection, you always need to explain what it is about. So I think it has always been falling a bit through the tracks before, you know, but right now I think it became so popular. So let's use this momentum as well in order to push it further on the political agenda, be it at a country level, be it more on a global, regional level. I don't have the perfect formula here, but I think we've gained in importance, and we need to find good designs in order to push it, be it from humanitarian side or from development side. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothea. I know this was not an easy questions, and we do have some very interesting questions coming online. And I'm also conscious of the time. There's one more question that I would like to ask Eileen, and also pick up some of these questions as we go along. But just for the audience, please do keep writing your questions, because even if we don't get a chance to answer them online right now, we will try and answer them in writing, and this will be put up on the GB subgroup page. So please do keep writing and sending your questions. So over to you, Eileen. If you could, you know, from a donor perspective, if there were any tips that you would like to share, or any experiences that would help with linking better, what would those be? Just one tip would be good enough.
I think I would put understanding the political economy and the context as the biggest tip. And by that, I mean understanding the incentives and the disincentives, in a sense, around, and who are your allies? I mean, it depends. Who are your allies? Does it make sense? In some cases, it may not make sense, you know, for whatever reason. And then looking at building allies around what the delivery of humanitarian cash, if in that particular context. But I do think investing at the beginning around that political economy is really critical to establish a sound foundation moving forward.
Thanks, Eileen. I now want to go to the questions that have come up on the chat box. I know Zara's question was partly picked up by Heidi when she was speaking, and I know Zara had 3 questions, so I'm going to only take one because there are many others. I'm moving to Gerardo, who has a question about upper middle income countries. And his question is that in upper middle income countries, you don't necessarily need to provide funding for, you know, cash transfer programming outside of the system, because there might be social protection systems in place already, and the governments may have scope to provide enough fiscal space to deliver cash to people. From a donor perspective, how could that kind of support be supported? You know, if an agency wants to provide technical assistance to governments to scale up their own social protection programs, is funding available for that from humanitarian, you know, lens? And I'm not going to pick up on any of you, whoever you know feels like answering the question. If you can just unmute yourself and answer.
No, I think, and that's where it's the challenge. So first, I do think, you know, even like middle income countries, when it comes to humanitarian crisis, even if social protection systems are in place, there might be a need for humanitarian assistance linked with social protection or outside to be able to help people. Let's just take the refugee crisis in Europe. There are social protection systems, you know, some or you know, take our example with Ecuador, where you have a social protection system, and perhaps that's where we can work on the linkages, you know, for with the example I gave on the graduation approach, for example, where we can systemically link individuals in programs with existing local national support system. Yeah, so there's still room for it. Now, I think the challenge again is this fine balance between humanitarian assistance and development, right? And to answer the question about, oh, since the late 80s, yes, we did some cash is a view, right? That we supported, for example, Cash for Work in Tunisia, but it was through Title I fund, you know, and to expand social protection system in Tunisia with Cash for Work to the poorest, right? But it's not necessarily what we do with humanitarian assistance, right? And our fund priorities is to save lives, right? So we need to make sure we build these linkages without diverting resources and attention to the need of saving these lives. There is timing for it, and often it's the most challenging, you know. There's an urgency that requires to rapidly program funds to get people life-saving assistance when a crisis hits, and that is not always conducive to link with social protection system. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Okay.
Thanks, William. Would any of the other panelists like to come back on the specific question around provision of technical assistance to governments where there might be fiscal space within the government to, you know, scale up, and whether you know, something like that is currently funded at all, or is that something that as donors we should be looking at?
May I come in on this one?
Yeah, yes, yes, Jyoti.
Just shortly, I was just trying to raise my hand. Look, what we do as European Commission, actually for us, this is of utmost importance that, of course, fiscal space, we have this discussion, we have a huge program, thematic program, we call this, but actually we are doing this. On one side, we give support on sector policy formulation, implementation, social protection, which goes hand in hand with public finance management. This is about this one, you know, how to kind of manage the fiscal space, which might be there, which might not be there, more or less. So how to deal with funds in order to kind of do a proper planning, implementation, follow up, monitoring of funds, because it's so important. We cannot only talk about the policies, we need to talk about the money here as well. So this is what we are doing. This is why we do most of our social protection programs as well, so budget support, because there again we kind of enable our partners to do the programs themselves. This is so important according to their sector national policies. And we think that humanitarian aid and social protection and medium long-term social protection support needs to go hand in hand. We don't see this as two different shoes. For us, it's the same pair of shoes, obviously. So one doesn't kind of prevent in doing the others. So this is what we are doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jyoti. And I don't want to put anyone on the spot here, but if you know, if either of you could answer this question that Carla has asked, the first one, which is about donor coordination. This is about what she's saying is essentially that, you know, we talk a lot about internal coordination between the humanitarian development teams within donor agencies and also within all our agencies. But what about the coordination between donors in supporting programs? So some examples that she's quoted here are from Ethiopia, the PSNP example where donors came together. But the real question is there any kind of a mapping where donors have come together to support programs that kind of link humanitarian cash and social protection? and whether that is something that is needed. So more about that, and if there are any challenges around strengthening donor coordination on this issue particularly. So this question really is to anyone, Jyote, you or Eileen, or William, or Heidi, whoever wants to pick on this. It will be great if you can have examples.
Napur, I'll come in on,
Okay,
on that. And I actually think when you're talking about coordination, often when you find a gap or challenges, often it's around the incentives or lack of incentive as to why that coordination is happening or not. And often it's quite complex, and I think it takes time. And there's an underestimation of the actual investment required to move some of those agendas forward. And I think Ethiopia is a good example where actually there has been substantial progress around that coordination in a sort of political context where you're having a transition. So I think when we are talking about the sort of humanitarian and development, I do think making sure at a country context that there is coordination across development partners is central, and that there are mechanisms bringing sort of both the humanitarian and development partners or social protection partners to talk. And that has happened in Ethiopia. Like we chaired the Humanitarian Resilience Donor Group, and also we chaired the Social Protection Group in 2018. And we did bring partners together and have those conversations, both in a formal setting, but also sometimes it needs to go beyond that to really understand why some of the barriers or challenges are happening. So I think when we're talking about coordination, it's not only the resources to coordinate, but understanding the underlying reasons why it's not happening, what's actually needed, and then finding quite creative ways in terms of moving that forward. And I guess we all collectively have a responsibility to do that. But I do think there's been progress even at a global level, having worked in Ethiopia and Tanzania and come back to headquarters quite recently. I mean, it was quite, as part of the Grand Bargain humanitarian cash transfer and social protection, it was quite encouraging to see such a broad range of actors working together. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. I was looking at the other question that has been asked by Luca, and you've partly kind of answered that around coordination and through finding creative ways for funding. But I think his question is a bit more broader about what is the role that donors can play in linking social protections and social protection and cash transfers. Any other insights other than what Eileen has already said? If Heidi or William, you want to come in, go ahead, William.
I'll jump in just quickly. Yes, it's about coordination, but it's a big endeavor to ask humanitarian to coordinate, these linkages with social protection and longer term coordination. We are part of the solution, but it's not only exclusively on us, right? And I think there's someone we shouldn't forget here, they are like the host governments, right? Because it's great if we have the intention to do this, to make these linkages. But the big question, we need to see also the long-term commitment we're asking from governments, right? Like, do they have the fiscal policy to put in place then to make these systems sustainable? Do they have the political capital to bring, to generate revenues for their budget to set up these systems, or to have a bigger contingency funding in their annual budget? So all these, technical questions, but beyond that, strategic and political ultimately are critical, and they require the buy-in from host government. And I think let's not forget that. It's very important as well.
Thanks, William. This issue of coordination is a very interesting one, because also there is no sector in the humanitarian world on social protection. So therefore, the whole coordination becomes a bit more difficult and fuzzy as well. I'm looking at the questions, and there's a question from Catherine, which also kind of borders on this issue of coordination. And let me read this out. I think what she's asking is coordination with national government, civil society, ensure that we have solid data sharing mechanisms to ensure deduplication, assessing impact across humanitarian development assistance via cash transfers, and quality aspects, including social accountability, inclusion of most vulnerable linkages with other resilience building. So the value proposition of donors' investment in those hinges on showcasing evidence over time. So does anybody want to pick this up?
I can come in, Nupur.
Yes, please, Heidi.
I'm going to touch on this question and some of the other ones actually is, I think, Catherine, it's a good question. And I think we all, when we start to look at data sharing mechanisms and deduplication, et cetera, we see the vast potential there is for data sharing, and also quickly understand how complex it is and how many, vested interests there are in one's own system or data protection. And it really can get quite muddled and messy quite quickly. And I think that it is certainly a really important and top topic that should be continually worked upon and raised. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that can take a huge amount of time and effort. In terms of years and a lot of effort. And so I know World Vision has had success in some contexts working on this. So, a fantastic leader on this topic, but it hasn't been as successful in other contexts. And I was going to actually mention, in terms of tips of ways to and areas to start moving forward, is also to say that while we should ensure that that is always an agenda topic and it is always being worked on because it is really fundamental, that we also don't get bogged down in it and feel that we can't work on linkages in many other areas, across the delivery chain, because we don't have a shared data system and agreements. We realize that would be helpful, but there are other ways and ways around it, and other entry points. And so to not get bogged down on that, but to have more of a can-do attitude and to start where we can, where there's interest, opportunities, and entry points. And so maybe not exactly what you wanted to hear, but I think we need to be careful to think that that is going to solve all of the issues. And just also on Luca's question too, I think that we have, as donors, a convening power, and so to use that as well to bring actors together. And one example from Iraq, where I did really focus on this for 2 years, was we actually funded and convened a workshop between the World Bank and government partners, as well as the humanitarian cash actors. And this was 2 years into the Mosul response. But the first time that these actors had actually been in the same room together for 2 days. And it was, really started a whole process of relationship building and linkages and understanding each other's programs and ways forward. And there is evidence there on thereafter how the two sides came together to look at targeting and realize some of their commonalities over just the differences. But it was really important for the government as well. And so I think that convening power and brokering those relationships and continuing to push and check in and hold actors accountable that say they are coordinating, but that might be very irregular, to keep checking in on that is something that we can also do as donors who speak across both sectors and with partners on both sides. So I just want to add those comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi, for jumping in on that. And I can see that there are lots of questions. There are lots of questions, and thank you, Sigrid, for answering some questions as well as we go along. That's very helpful. and I, unfortunately, the time is really running out, and I have just one question that I can take right now. This was from Stephanie on the role of BRICS. And so the BRICS countries, the role of those in funding linkages, I believe. Do you have any opinion on that, any of you?
Is that a question, or was it meant to be BRACS on graduation? So
Oh, was it BRACS?
or BRACS?
Because it said BRICS.
You know.
I assumed it was BRICS. So Brazil, India, and maybe we'll wait for Stephanie to clarify that in the chat box. Oh yes, she says it's BRACS. So and especially linked with the graduation bit. So does any of you want to answer this as the last question for today? And but audiences, please do keep writing the questions. We will definitely try and answer them in writing. So does anybody want to take that question on BRACS and graduation? Okay, so I don't see any hands up, and I am assuming that this is going to take a bit of thinking through to answer. We will try and get an answer for this, Stephanie, in writing, and this will probably be put up on the, Lois, please correct me if I'm wrong, this will be put up on the GB subgroup page on sp.org within the community of practice on social protection in crisis. So so do look up on that. So as we are just 1 minute away from the end of this webinar, I would like to thank all the panelists. Thank you so very much for making time, and also for being so proactive in answering and looking at the questions and answering them as you go along with some of the questions that I was asking you. So that's really good. And thanks a lot to all the audiences here who've been asking questions. And please do keep asking these questions, because they are really important. With that, let me hand over to Lois for closing the webinar. This has been a great experience for me personally, sitting here and not answering questions, but asking questions. So thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. And Lois, if there's anything that we need to do to close, otherwise we can close the webinar. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you very much, Nupur, and all the panelists and the audience for participating today. And as Nupur has said, all the unanswered questions will be posted. We'll post the responses up on sp.org as soon as we have them written. But wishing you all a good day or evening ahead.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.